Yeah? Good. Guten Abend, good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to see you all here. My name is Elad Lapidot. You don't hear? Better? Okay, so we'll try to speak like this. So again, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Elad Lapidot. I'm a professor for Jewish studies at the University of Lille in France, and I also work here at the Katholische Academy at a relatively new initiative that is called the Berlin Center for Intellectual Diaspora, that has been working for about 1.5 years. The initiative tries to create space for discussions on contemporary current themes and debates that are connected to the interrelations between society, culture, religion, and politics. And in this framework, we organize different events, different lectures, workshops, and so forth. And this evening is a part of this new initiative. At the center of this initiative, the thematic center, stands, as the name suggests, diaspora. And one of our attempts is to explore different models, different ideas that are connected to diaspora, not only as a social phenomena, not only as a political constellation, but also as a form of knowledge, what we call diasporic knowledge. Since this initiative, among others, draws on the intellectual traditions of both Christianity and specifically Catholicism, but also Judaism, when we work around the idea of diasporic knowledge, one of the main cultures of knowledge within Jewish intellectual traditions that is interesting for us is the Talmud, the rabbinic tradition that has the Talmudic text, the Talmudic culture in its middle. So the Talmud, the Talmudic culture, or the rabbinic culture is something that around which we try to raise questions and to organize events. And those of you who are a little familiar with contemporary modern approaches to, let's say, Jewish intellectual tradition, the focus of the Talmud stands in some contrast to other attempts, such as the attempts to focus on the tradition of philosophy within Judaism, or the attempts to focus on the Kabbalah. So we try to explore the idea of the Talmud or Talmudic tradition as the center of diasporic civilization of knowledge and thought. This week, we have here, the last days and tomorrow also, we have a workshop that was conceived and is being carried out with all what I said in mind, a workshop that is focused on what we call modern Talmudic hermeneutics, which is being led by two instructors that are sit with here today, Elchanan Reiner and Oded Schechter. We invited researchers from abroad and from here, from Berlin, and we sit together and try to discuss different issues that are connected to the modern Talmudic culture of knowledge, not only the ancient, but the modern, as a modern approach to knowledge, to politics, to society. Around this workshop, this 3-day workshop, we also organized 2 public events. The workshop itself is closed to the public, but we organized 2 public events around this workshop and thematically linked to what is happening in the workshop. 2 discussion evenings that concern what we can call socio-political thought within this modern Talmudic rabbinic tradition. The center of these two evenings could be called something like a rabbinic dissidence, a certain position within the rabbinic Talmudic tradition that produces a certain resistance, dissidence, social critique in different moments of modern Jewish existence. This Sunday we had the first evening, the first discussion that referred to the 17th century, to the movement of Sabbatianism, important messianic movement that was very powerful and had a lot of effects on not only the 17th century but on modern Jewish existence. And we had a speaker, Yakov Rabkin, who presented his book on rabbinic resistance to Sabbatianism, a specific figure, Jacob Sespotas, who presented a dissidence, a critique at that time of the 17th century, when Messianism swept across Jewish communities. He, from within the Talmudic tradition, developed a opposition, a critique of that, and we had Mark Alan Waknin, who was responding to Yakov Rabkin. This evening, we focus on a different moment within modern Jewish history, on a different movement, as powerful, perhaps much more powerful than Sabbatianism, namely Zionism. This is the focus of our evening. Rabbinic dissidence, and today opposition to Zionism in Jewish Orthodoxy. This is the title of our evening, and we have two guests that I will shortly present. Before that, I will just say a few words just to create a certain framework to what hopefully we're going to discuss tonight. Zionism can be easily seen as one of the most powerfully transformative movements within modern Judaism. On the one hand, it's a movement that harks back to different important elements within the Jewish tradition, most importantly, the name Zion, a certain desire towards Zion, and a certain idea of return to Zion. Nevertheless, at the same time, Zionism generates a deep change within Jewish culture and collective existence. Significantly, this change concerns precisely the diasporic nature of Jewish civilization and knowledge. Amnon Raz Krakotskin, therefore, located at the center of Zionism and later of the state of Israel, a certain element of negation of Galut, negation of the exilic, historical exilic existence, or you could also say diasporic existence of Judaism. Large parts of the current debate, or in plural, debates or discussions around Judaism and Jews, including anti-Semitism, concern the reality that was created in different ways by Zionism, namely the statist Jewish reality, the state of Israel, the Jewish state. Very often, critique against Zionism and the state of Israel is understood very quickly, too quickly, as anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. However, Zionism, as the negation of exile, originally and essentially, perhaps first and foremost, was and is still standing in strong conflict with non-statist existence of Judaism, namely the diasporic, exilic Jewish civilization. This evening, we focus, therefore, on the critique of Zionism from within Jewish culture, from which is Jewish existence, from precisely diasporic Judaism, from the Judaism of the Talmud, Rabbinic Judaism, or as our title says, Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism. To discuss this, I now turn to our two guests for tonight that I will shortly present, and then I will let them speak. Our first guest, Yakov Rabkin, has been professor of history at the University of Montréal since 1973 and has held visiting positions at many universities worldwide. His areas of interest include contemporary Jewish history, international relations, in science, as well as demodernization. Yakov Rabkin is the author of several books, including What is Modern Israel? And more recently, Judaism, Islam et Modernité. And this evening, our focus is on his book called A Threat from Within, a century of Jewish opposition to Zionism, which is available in 15 languages, including, since last year, in German, under the title Im Namen der Thora, die jüdische Opposition gegen den Zionismus. Our second guest, Hannah Tzuberi, was a researcher at the FU Berlin. She's the co-editor of Jewish Friends, Contemporary Figures of the Jew, and is working on a project titled Reviving Judaism, Reviving the Nation, Post-Holocaust Imaginaries of the German Nation-State. Her research interests include Talmud, Halakha, and contemporary European Jewry. Her work draws on the critical study of secularism and current discussions related to the co-constitutive relations between Europe, the European subject, and Europe's racial religious others. Thank you, both of you, for being with us tonight. And I will now invite Yakov Rabkin to speak about the opposition within Judaism to Zionism. Thank you.
Do you hear me well? Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege to be speaking here in the place devoted to interreligious understanding. And I am very happy to present the book that came out 2 years ago in German, which is, you could see the cover of it, as well as the original French version and the Hebrew. So the original book came out 18 years ago. It's a rather old book. And its history is strange because I had not written books in French before, even though I teach in French. But the French-Canadian publisher came to me and said, we would like you to write a book about whatever you want. And at that time, I was being solicited by the media because we had in Montreal a big demonstration against Zionism. People came from New York, very Orthodox Jews, and when I suggested the topic to the French-Canadian publisher, he took it as if I were about to write about boiling snow. But these things don't happen. Jewish opposition to Zionism is something which makes no sense. Well, finally, the publisher agreed and the book came out. So the phenomenon of Jewish opposition to Zionism is important because it raises issues, questions about diaspora, which is the main focus of the center that organizes this, and As well, it, I think, raises more general issues of relations between religion and politics. Before going any further, I'd like to define orthodoxy, because the title that was proposed was Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is a relatively new term. If we consider Judaism to have several millennia of history, and Rabbinic Judaism almost 2,000 years, Orthodoxy is relatively recent. It emerged in the early 19th century as a reaction to Reform Judaism. When Judaism split, there have been many splits in Judaism, and one of them is the emergence of Reform Jews, I think in northern Germany first, and then a counter movement which called itself Orthodox. So it's a purely European phenomenon. Well, later it became American, of course, but non-Ashkenazi, non-European Jews don't really relate to it because they didn't have the same issues of secularization, of reform, and so on. Therefore, Orthodoxy really means European, American, and Israeli varieties, but we'll use it in a more liberal sense, as you will see. So first of all, a few words about traditional attitudes towards the land of Israel. So what is the land of Israel? What some people call it Holy Land. In the traditional parlance, it's called the Land of Holiness. So it's not quite Holy Land, it's a different thing. And you don't have to go far to understand the relation to it. It's a conditional relationship. And I quote one of the best known, I think, passages in Jewish liturgy, Shema Israel, so beware lest your heart be seduced and you turn astray and serve gods of others and bow to them. Then the wrath of the Lord will blaze against you, and he'll restrain the heaven so that there will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its produce, and you will swiftly be banished from the goodly land which the Lord gives you. So this kind of threats are all over the Pentateuch, and the prophets also relate to it. And that's why I bring a sentence which in French makes more sense, but Lévinas once wrote that ce n'est pas une terre promise, c'est une terre permise. So it's a permitted land. It's not something which is promised, it's something which one may use under certain conditions. And I think this conditionality of the ownership of the land, so to speak, even though the Pentateuch again reminds several times that the land belongs to the Lord, it doesn't belong to you, you're just temporary inhabitants of it. So it's a very strong motive in traditional sources. And indeed, in the Jewish tradition, it's considered there would have been two exiles, one to Babylonia, and then later during the Roman occupation of the land of holiness. And I'm not going to go into whether it was a real exile, how many people were exiled, because there's a lot of controversy about it. But what is important is that it's part of the tradition. And indeed, Jewish liturgy includes several references to a speedy return to the land, to the blessing, the grace after meals, said it all over. You can find references to return to the land. And indeed, we could see it as something quite natural. Someone was exiled, and then you want to go back to your homeland. However, the relationship is different. Because if it was conditional ownership, that means, and indeed the sources interpret it very clearly, that there must have been transgression, there must have been a sin, because exile is a punishment. And therefore, there were several strategies of return that have been developed in traditional sources. Usually, we refer to a legend that is often quoted with respect to the second exile, and the second exile is the one that continues today in spite of the existence of the State of Israel and so on. The second exile was supposed to be caused by gratuitous hatred. I'm not going to go into the story that is behind it. Hatred without reason, gratuitous hatred. And therefore, it's quite logical that the way to return to the land is to exhibit gratuitous love. So you place it entirely on the moral, ethical level, and the return has to be operated as a spiritual development, as an improvement, as purification, the different words that could be used. And the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, specifies what is called the three oaths. The three oaths, you could see the text, the description rather. The Jews were sworn not to forcefully return or reclaim the land, and not to rebel against the other nations. And the other nations, in their turn, were sworn not to subjugate the Jews excessively. So you have, and these three oaths have been very important throughout the 2,000 years, well, Talmud is less than 2,000 years, but throughout centuries. It was invoked every time that there was a possibility of massive return, because the return was to be operated by the Messiah. When Messianic times come, then and only then there will be a peaceful return as part of the general redemption of the world. So it becomes a much more general project than just a return of a group of people to the place where they used to live. And indeed, the Jewish tradition is very careful to distance itself from any attempt at military conquest or anything related to violence. And we should remember that the founder of Rabbinic Judaism, Yochanan ben Zakkai, is quoted as someone who today we may actually qualify as a traitor, because he was in a besieged Jerusalem and he sent an arrow to the Roman troops with a little note saying, "I'm among the admirers of the emperor." And then he was smuggled out of Jerusalem and started essentially Rabbinic Judaism somewhere far from Jerusalem. So there is a relationship of Rabbinic Judaism that finds unreasonable violence, and certainly the rebellion of the 2nd century as well, as something that impedes development of Jews as a nation devoted to holiness, because the major injunction in the Pentateuch is, "Be holy, because I'm holy," said God. So whenever there was a possibility to move back to Palestine, most Jews didn't do it. And there was one episode which is particularly sort of propitious for moving back to Palestine. That was the expulsion from Spain. Just it so happened I flew here from Madrid, and the Jews were expelled from Spain, then from Portugal. The Ottoman Navy and fleet helped them evacuate. And at that time, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was happy to receive Jews from Spain. But very few of them, usually scholars, went to Palestine. Most of them went to Izmir, Istanbul, Amsterdam, London, whatever. So this messianic prudence, this attitude of not provoking, of being conciliatory, is very much part of Rabbinic Judaism. And in the interval between destruction and redemption, the primary Jewish task is to respond fully to the biblical commandments and to study, to fulfill the written and oral law, to establish a proper Jewish society based on the commandments and ideals. And then, as far as the future is concerned, patience and prayer. So this has been the traditional attitude towards return to the land. However, there are other actors for whom this story is important. And one group of actors are Christians, because for them, the return of the Jews to the Holy, or for some of them, for the return of the Jews to the Holy Land would be a necessary step for the second coming of Jesus. And therefore, particularly in Protestant sources and Protestant communities, there were attempts to organize a restoration of Jews in the Holy Land. And particularly in English-speaking countries, Britain and the United States. And the picture that you already saw is just one of prominent, what today we would call Christian Zionists, but it would be anachronistic to call them Zionists because the name was not invented yet. Lord Earl Shaftesbury, who was a very committed Christian. He founded an association devoted to the promotion of Christianity among the Jews and the restoration of Jews in the Holy Land. I just mentioned one person. He was not the first. There were several antecedents, but he perhaps was one of the more influential because he was close to ruling circles in Britain, and he understood the political aspect of it. He was the author of a memorandum to Protestant monarchs of Europe for the restoration of Jews to Palestine. And it was published, as you see, in London in Colonial Times in 1841. And the word colonial already says something. It means that for Britain, it was both religiously desirable and politically convenient to have Jews restore to Palestine and control that particular area. Indeed, that Protestant Zionism it's not only a curious vignette in the history of Zionism, but it is an important stepping stone. And the next person I would like to mention would be William Henry Heckler, who comes from a family of Anglican pastors, actually of German origin, who moved to England, and then he was born in India because he was sent there to propagate Christianity. And he was a very committed activist for the restoration of Jews in Palestine. He didn't stay in India. It so happened that he became the chaplain of the British Embassy in Vienna. And here we're getting to real Zionism. In Vienna, he met a successful journalist and playwright, Theodore Herzl, with whom he found a lot of common interest, because Judenstaat, the State for the Jews, a book written by Herzl, was very impressive for Heckler. Heckler, who himself wanted Jews to go back to Palestine, found this book very promising. And there was a very mutually fruitful relationship between the two. A book published in the 50s, which I quote, published first in French and then later in English, describes this relationship. And in fact, Heckler was buried with honors, reburied with honors, with the presence of the Israeli ambassador in London. So he is considered an important actor in bringing about, finally, Jewish Zionism. Because you may ask, and what about Lord Shaftesbury? Well, he actually approached the Jewish community, Sephardic Jewish community in London, with the proposition that we'll organize your restoration to Palestine. And quite predictably, the answer was, thank you, but no thank you, and we'll wait for Messiah to come. In the meantime, we'll live here and benefit the country where we live. So that's a traditional Jewish response. However, Herzl was anything but traditional. He was, in a way, a dissident, but there were many like him. He was rather secularized, indifferent to religion. He wasn't anti-religious, he was rather indifferent. And for him, the important thing was to organize a political movement so that Jews finally will do something about return to Palestine. Not necessarily to Palestine, because there was also, as some of you know, there was a Uganda project, but let's talk about the return to Palestine for simplicity's sake. And indeed, the first Zionist Congress was organized in Basel in 1897. And there were several congresses later. And that's how the World Zionist Organization came to be, later financial institutions, colonial trust and all that. But what is important, perhaps to underline, that it happened in Basel and not in Munich, where it was supposed to be held. Now, why was it in Basel and not in Munich? Because German Jewish organization protested vigorously against holding a Zionist Congress in Germany. And here we're getting to opposition. Why this project would cause opposition? Of course, some of the elements of the Zionist discourse was very reminiscent of anti-Semitism. And that's what made Jews extremely uncomfortable, because they had invested tremendous efforts in France, in Germany, in Britain, in the United States, to be part of the nation. And here comes the Zionist movement, says, no, you're not part of the nation. You're a separate nation. You belong somewhere else, actually another country. And this is very, very similar to what many anti-Semites used to say, and I think continue to say, that you don't belong here. You're an alien. You're a stranger. And there's no way you could be assimilated and absorbed by the majority nation. So these similarities is one reason that Zionism was opposed by the more, I would say, more cultured Jews, Jews who learned the languages of the lands where they lived, who joined professions, who went to universities, who were modernized Jews. I don't want to use secularized because some of them remained quite observant, but they were part of society. Incidentally, like Herzl himself, he was part of Viennese society. But the problem with the Zionist activists in Vienna was that very few Jews from Central and Western Europe were interested in the project. And the only place that Zionism provoked real interest was the Russian Empire. And since it was largely a European project, the non-European countries are not relevant at this point. In Russian Empire, the situation was different. There was no emancipation, there was no absorption of Jews into mainstream society. And on top of that, there was geographic restriction. That Jews could only live in what today would be the Baltic countries, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Moldova. So that's the western area of the Russian Empire. And in that western area, you had some processes that were similar to what was going on in Central Europe, namely acculturation to the majority culture, learning of Russian language, identifying with Russian writers, but there was no possibility to move to the big cities. So these Jews who were secularized. Many of them rejected Judaism, rejected all religious commandments, but they couldn't move out, nor could they become part of the majority nation. Unlike, say, a French Jew who lives in Alsace, he moves to Paris, changes the name, marries a Catholic, disappears. That option was practically absent unless one wanted to go through conversion. And some did, but usually for career purposes. So these secularized Jews were frustrated because they couldn't advance professionally, they couldn't advance culturally, and many of them disproportionately participated in the revolutionary movement in Russia. That's where they acquired certain values of, namely political terrorism, among other things. And they were the soldiers of Zionism, whereas Herzl and his friends were generals, but they didn't have an army. The army, so to speak, came from the Russian Empire, and there were several waves of immigration to Palestine. Not surprisingly, these groups were very much to the left of political spectrum. They wanted to develop a new society, a new socialist society in the new land. They were very idealistic, many of them. They despised bourgeois nationalism because it distracted Jewish masses from political struggle. And this Zionist settlement in early 20th century was largely non-observant, in this case, unlike Herzl, many of them anti-religious people who wanted to build a new society using a new language, a modernized version of what used to be called the language of holiness. And of course, this was a radical departure from traditional Judaism. So how did traditional Judaism react to this? Well, there were very different reactions. And you could see here just bring this picture, very different things. You could see Arafat with his Minister of Jewish Affairs, Rabbi Moshe Hirsch, whom I interviewed preparing for my book. And you could see also protesters against occupation, that occupation is not my Judaism. So there are all kinds of varieties. But what interests us here, more than other varieties, is the Orthodox one. And of course, since Russian Empire was the cradle of the Zionist, of practical Zionism, the opposition also came, first of all, from Eastern Europe. Ferocious opposition. Here I'm just quoting two prominent Talmudists who started actually a new school of Talmudic study, Rabbi Soloveitchik Yosef Ber and his son Chaim. So the first one said, a new sect like that of Sabbatai Tzvi, may the name of the evildoers rot. So here we have a connection, I don't know if Elad meant it, with the first lecture, where we had opposition to Sabbatianism. And here, very often, and Soloveitchik is not the only one who mentions Shabtai Tzvi as an example of what Zionism appears like to be. Namely, it promises messianic deliverance, it promises return to the Holy Land, but in fact, it's a false messiah. And there is a lot of writings about the whole idea of false messiah, Zionism as false messiah. And his son Chaim writes, the people of Israel should, well, the people of Israel meaning Jewish people really, the people of Israel should take care not to join a venture that threatens their souls, to destroy religion, and is a stumbling block to the house of Israel. So not only it's not a messianic movement, but it's a stumbling block against redemption. So it's much worse. Not that it's not a right kind of redemption, it's an obstacle to redemption. So you see how categorical the opposition is. The two Soloveitchiks whom I mentioned are known as Talmudists, and they did not belong to the Hasidic movement, which was another split that began in the 18th century and continues. So here is, I'm giving you a picture of one of Hasidic rabbis, again, Eastern Europe. It's today very close. It's in Ukraine, next to the Polish border, Belz. I'll give you a very long citation because I think it's important to understand how he related to it. So one day, a man and his son paid a visit to the Rebbe. The son was preparing to make Aliyah, to go to the land of Israel. How did he intend to behave once there, asked the Rebbe. Where will he live? Will he observe the Sabbath and the other Jewish laws? The father replied that the love for Israel had swept over his son. Do you speak of love for the land of Israel? Asked the rabbi. Go into my house of study, and you will find assiduous youths who are exploring the Torah. In each of their hearts there is more love for Israel than among 1,000 Zionists. Love for Israel is of no matter to the Zionists. They wish simply to free themselves from the yoke of the Torah and the commandments. It suits them to act without any moral constraints. The Zionists go into the land of Israel, kicking out the Torah and committing forbidden acts. Is that what they mean by the love for the land of Israel? Love for the land of Israel is tied up with the love of God and the love of the Torah. They cannot be kept apart, end of quote. So you see, it's a very strong argument against the secular, the militantly secular element in the Zionist settlement at that time. But there were several movements, again, of Russian Jews to go to Palestine. One of them was Chibat Zion, the lovers of Zion, and a prominent German Orthodox rabbi, Samson Raphael Hirsch, was approached to support them. He didn't. Actually, his son wrote a vitriolic critique of Zionism, but Rabbi Hirsch's father was more restrained, but then he wrote the following, and I can show you, no, that's Chafetz Chaim. Here's Samson Raphael Hirsch. Not in order to shine as a nation among nations do we raise our prayers and hopes for a reunion in our land, but in order to find a soil for the better fulfillment of our spiritual vocation in that reunion, and in the land which was promised and given, and again promised for our observance of the Torah. But this very vocation obliges us until God shall call us back to the Holy Land, to live and to work as patriots wherever he has placed us, to collect all the physical, material, and spiritual forces, and all that is noble in Israel to further the wealth of the nations which have given us shelter. Very similar to what the British Jews replied to Lord Shaftesbury. It obliges us, I continue the quote, further to allow our longing for the far-off land to express itself only in mourning, in wishing and hoping, and only through the honest fulfillment of all Jewish duties to await the realization of this hope. But it forbids us to strive for the reunion of the possession of the land by any except spiritual means. So you see, there is a lot of distancing from, even there was no Zionist movement as such during Rabbi Hirsch's time. During his son's time there was, and that perhaps explains why he wrote his anti-Zionist book. But it's important to understand that for these rabbis, Zionism, or even pre-Zionism, was something unacceptable. And in the book, I bring a lot of quotes from other rabbis, which of course, I cannot do tonight. I'll just say that for some people, Zionism today, as I think Elad said in the very beginning, is almost identical with Judaism. So they take all Jews to be Zionists, and therefore opposition to Zionism is something anti-Semitic. I think in this country, this point of view is well presented. But there were other Zionists, and there are other Zionists, who are religious, who are observant. And how do these Orthodox rabbis relate to them? It's interesting that even beyond Europe, Sephardic Rabbi Chaim Shaul Dawik, he was a Kabbalist in Jerusalem, and he related to the appearance of Mizrahi, the religious Zionist movement. He considered them hypocrites capable of leading more Jews into error than could the secular Jews, the secular Zionists. In other words, by being religious, they will mislead even better, because they'll show that, you know, we, and other sources compared them to swine. The swine has one of the characteristics of a kosher animal, but not the other one. And Chafetz Chaim, whose picture I'm showing here, compared them to armed bandits, while secular Zionists were for him unarmed bandits. Going further, and I was told that I have 5 minutes, here's a picture of Shaul Dawik. I'll just mention very briefly that within Palestine there was opposition to the Zionist settlement and to the pro-Zionist position of the British Mandate authorities. And for Orthodox anti-Zionists, he's a hero, Yakov Israel Dahan, a Dutch Jew who was assassinated as he was leaving the synagogue in Jerusalem in 1924 because he was extremely dangerous. He spoke several languages, he was a lawyer, he was kind of a modern Jew, but he allied himself with the Orthodox opponents of Zionism, and he was about to organize a delegation to London to try to influence British policy in Palestine. Well, he was the first, I think, it was the first political assassination, as far as I know, in Palestine. And it was done by Haganah, by, again, Russian Jews, essentially, who actively were really running the Zionist settlement in Palestine. Here's a picture of a contemporary movement which started in the 30s of last century, Neturei Karta. They, as you see, oppose Zionism, again for the same reasons of Messianic and so on, and they collaborate with Palestinians. You see here, I already showed you the picture of Moshe Hirsch, Rabbi Hirsch, who was Minister of Jewish Affairs in Palestinian Autonomy Government. And here you see a young member of Neturei Karta who live in Israel and but are violently opposed, not violently in the physical sense, to the Zionist character of the State of Israel. The theoretical basis of that was provided by Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, the Rebbe of Satmar, who wrote an important critique of Zionism by Yoel Moshe, and he brought about many Talmudic and other sources to justify principled opposition to Zionism and to the State of Israel. And he was very influential and totally independent in his judgment. So he remains one of the more important figures in rabbinical opposition to Zionism. Neturei Karta, here you have another picture of a young member, a boy, with a poster which I translated for your benefit. And the question may be asked, well, two questions. If they oppose Zionism so much, and they oppose the existence of the State of Israel, why do they live in Jerusalem? I've been asked this question many times, and I asked Rabbi Hirsch. And his answer was, I could characterize it as la longue durée. He said, we were here under the Ottomans, we were here under the British, and we'll be here after the Zionists. So for them, presence in Palestine is nothing to do with the structure of the state or so on. It's what I call longue durée. Another question is, does it still continue? When my book came out in Hebrew, you saw the Hebrew cover, in 2014, I arrived in Israel in the spring, and the following day I received a phone call from the publisher. I said, Yakov, did you organize it? I said, what? Open the television, switch on the television. And that's what I saw on television. A demonstration of Orthodox Jews at the entrance to Jerusalem, you know, and there were apparently 500,000 of them. Now, it's not China. 500,000 in Israel matters. And what they were protesting, they were protesting military draft. And of course, it was very, for me and for the publisher, convenient, because I was often asked on television, radio, why are they so opposed? say, well, because one of the reasons they oppose is they don't want to be part of the Zionist mainstream. And the army is a means of assimilating them to the Zionist mainstream. And that's what they really don't want. Because by and large, they're much more anti-Palestinian than the rest of Israeli society, except perhaps Neturei Karta and some others. But these 500,000 definitely are not progressive leftists. We are not talking about them. But they're opposed of joining the mainstream. So it's important to see that the Orthodox opposition to Zionism is both practical and theoretically based. At this point, I'll stop and leave the floor to Hannah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think I will stay here.
Thank you, Yakov, and for this fascinating presentation. And now, basically, we will start the discussion, and the first speaker will be Hannah with a few short remarks.
Yes, these remarks will be very, very short. Thank you for inviting me, first of all, and thank you for joining us also here in the Katholische Akademie. I have the difficult task of responding to the presentation, which is per se difficult because you have to sort of form your thoughts and articulate your thoughts in real time, kind of. But I will do my best, and I will progress as follows. I will present to you or respond with three general remarks that do not have any particular relation to Germany or Europe. And I will, from these general remarks, zoom down to, okay, how does this actually play out on the ground in a place such as Germany right now, which is the place I know best. So my input will be informed or is situated specifically here. It has a place and it has a time, which is now and here. The book that you presented, which I read, is very powerfully demonstrating that Zionism, political Zionism, is not necessarily, as it is oftentimes presented, a telos, a natural telos of Jewish history. These and these and this and this happens, and then comes Zionism, and it's sort of one red line, and your book sort of, through the Jewish tradition, rabbinic tradition, makes an argument against it, and zooms in onto the moments in which, or it sort of focuses on the kind of rupture that political Zionism, and specifically the emergence of the Israeli nation state, present in Jewish history, theologically. This rupture consists primarily, if I sort of very briefly summarize, in the way that the relation between Jews and the land of Israel, Eretz Israel, is being conceptualized, and in the way that Jews themselves, as a collective, are being the boundaries of this collective especially, are being thought about or conceptualized. Now, what my question would be regarding this moment of rupture that you see in Zionism is how does this actually develop, or is developing after the Holocaust, after the Shoah? Because opposition, Orthodox opposition to Zionism, it's in many ways a historical fact, and you can read the texts, and it's not something that we can contest. But after 1945, with the destruction of European Jewry, Orthodoxy as well, gradually, if I may sort of just put that very roughly, briefly, the story has many nuances, of course, but Orthodoxy too, and also in Europe, of course, may not necessarily theologically have embraced Zionism, but practically, politically, it gradually embraced the state of Israel as the primary political project of modernity. You can see that, or I can see that very practically when I look at the school books of my children who are going to an Orthodox school in Berlin, and most of the Kodesh material is being produced in Israel. So we have to take into account the transformations within Orthodoxy after the Holocaust, the kind of rupture that actually asks the question, what is the Holocaust to Orthodox Jewry, in Europe specifically, and maybe in Germany also specifically, I don't know. And then think into that as well the way that the state of Israel, even though it may have been founded as a state that was supposed to produce the sort of secular citizen, the secular Jewish citizen, right, is today also a center of Jewish traditional Orthodox whatever life. It's one of the two major centers of contemporary Jewish life. And specifically for Europe, of course, with Israel being spatially more proximate, this is the point where sort of Europe is a bit of the periphery of the state of Israel in terms of including Jewish Orthodox life, not only as an identitarian projection plane, but as practically the place where you can send your kids for yeshiva, or where you can get teaching stuff from, or whatever. You can sort of make a long list of close relations between Orthodox Jewish communities in Europe, specifically in Germany, and the state of Israel, or Israeli orthodoxies, right? So in plural. The second point, a little bit different. Your book describes the transformation in how, after the Holocaust and with the emergence of political Zionism, Jewish sovereignty and autonomy transitioned from what I would call a sovereignty over time and temporality to territory, right? Tradition, Jewish tradition, rabbinic tradition is in many ways a master of time. It defines times. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world, but it matters what time it is so that you know when Shabbat starts. And that's the normative boundary, right? And this is where rabbinic authority is being practiced. It's where it's about the clock and not necessarily if you're sitting on the tree or not. Even though this is discussed as well, but and with the emergence of modern nation states, including the state of Israel, the Jewish political projects consist in autonomy and sovereignty over a piece of territory, of earth. Now, the way that this plays out in a place like Germany after 45 among Jews means that when German Jews after 45 describe their relation to the newly founded state of Israel, we get, of course, many different answers. I know that I'm oversimplifying this, but they strongly identified with Israel and supported this new state unconditionally, because through this support, they could also legitimize themselves of being not in Israel, because it was very shameful to be as a German Jew after 45 in Germany and not having managed to migrate to the States or or to Israel, right? It was you were a traitor to the Jewish collective, more or less officially, when you stayed in Germany as a Jew after 45. Again, I oversimplify that this story has many facets, and you know, point taken, but German Jews oftentimes related to the state of Israel, or when they even now when they travel to Israel, this is not necessarily out of Zionist yearnings, some kind of religious, you know, this is our, only here we can be Jews or something like that, but identification with the state of Israel and its support, its unconditional support, enabled a sort of diasporic being here. It enabled one as a Jew to be not in Israel. So this is sort of the, you know, where is exactly, what's diaspora even? That's in that sense. And a third point, I'll start again on a general level. I would identify, or I think one can differentiate roughly between two different directions from which currently critique to Zionism is being articulated. One is coming from a more universal direction, that is sort of, let's say, people like Judith Butler would come from that direction, and others like Daniel Boyarin and you as well, I would put you in that box as well, critique the state of Israel and political Zionism rather from the point of rabbinic Judaism, particularity, and so forth, right? Now, when I take that down to Germany, and I'm asking, okay, where is that Jewish particularity? Where actually is Jewish autonomous agency or something like that being practiced? Then the very last thing I would see on the ground is Jewish agency as Torah u'mitzvot, and rather as agency that is being enacted through or in relation, again, to the Holocaust, either as in the framework of victimhood, or as resistance to Nazism, or as resilience, or as disintegratedness, or whatever. But there is no such thing. I would mich aus dem Fenster lehnen, how you say that? I would sort of go as far and say that there is just right now no such thing as, in contemporary Germany, something like a broader concept of Jewish agency that would consist in Torah u'mitzvot. Again, this has obvious historical reasons, right? There just is. It was destroyed, and I mean, there was a genocide. But my question would be, right now, if I look at the few Jewish observant Orthodox communities that do exist in Germany, it may practically, again, well be that they will be, even though they are here, they will be Zionists. They will be Zionists because because this is where their educational resources and where their Jewish knowledge and so forth comes from. Even again, not necessarily theologically, but practically for the next 500 years or so, I would venture that this is the direction that that we are going. And I think with this, this was short enough. With this, I would leave, or with this, I would close. These were just three, not necessary. The remarks are related, but they can be separated. And yeah, I would like to open the floor and open the discussion to the audience.
Thank you.
Oh yeah,
much,
actually,
Hannah.
sorry. Yeah, actually, you could.
Thank you, Hannah, for the interesting, good notes. Yes, please. Yakov, maybe you want to react very quickly to. You don't have to react to everything, whatever you choose, and then we'll open up the questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Hannah, for reading my book. It's a long book.
Yes.
Well, both of you read it.
Do you want to have the...
Oh, yeah. Sure. Do I have to switch it on?
I switched it on already.
Yes. So thank you for commenting and for reading the book. You asked what happens after the Holocaust. Well, as you know, in Israel, there is a moment of silence on the day of commemoration of the Holocaust. And it has been noticed that some Orthodox Jews don't stop and continue walking. And they were asked, why is it that Orthodox Jews in fact suffered disproportionately during the Second World War because they're more identifiable. And yet they don't identify with the commemoration. And the answer was, this was a punishment because we were distanced from the Torah. We don't want to waste this moment. Rather, we would build yeshivas and we'll study Torah, because this kind of commemoration is not Jewish. We have to repair what we did wrong. And what we did wrong was being far from Torah and commandments. And this is a very traditional attitude towards calamity. In fact, that's the traditional attitude which is totally alien to the vast majority of Jews today. And this indeed explains why the reactions are different. So even those Jews who are observant, for them consider all calamity as stemming from punishment from God is something which is not very easy to articulate and particularly to internalize. So that's what I could say, that for the Orthodox, the prayers haven't changed. You know, there's a state of Israel, all right, but then we say several times on several occasions, because of our sins we have been exiled from our land. You know, no one suggests to change it. Or some people do, of course. Actually, some people do in Israel, and I think it's a very honest effort to say, well, the rabbinical Judaism here in Israel is over. We have to have a new Torah Eretz Israel and Yehudut Eretz Israel, so we have to have a new situation. But so far it hasn't happened in any majority. Maybe some settlement in the West Bank they do it, but it's not happened. Now, what you said about identification of German Jews, what makes sense to me, but the two centers, and the other center is North America, apparently. Indeed, I can just tell you about one anecdote, and I think it illustrates what goes on. I was in Shanghai, in China, and I went to the synagogue, and it was Shabbat. It was in the spring, and the rabbi gave a speech talking about commandments and Sfirat HaOmer, and then there was, as usual, I suppose that we'll have here as well, a reception. And I was standing next to a couple of ladies, American, both of them, and one of them was a modern lady, the way she was dressed. The other one was a Hasidic one, and the modern one was really indignant. She says, look, we are on the eve of the Day of Independence of Israel, and he didn't even mention it. What kind of a rabbi is this? Judaism is impossible without Israel. And the Hasidic lady says, why do you think it is impossible? We will live perfectly well in Williamsburg and nothing happens to us. So they kept talking back and forth, and then I had to control my pride. The Hasidic lady said, you know, this Canadian professor wrote a book about this. You should read it. And I think it shows, in fact, how two approaches. The one that you certainly see among more modern Jews, and Zionism is a form of modernization of Jews, we should definitely say that, and those who live a more traditional, self-sufficient way. Even though the same Satmar Jews who live in New York, they travel back and forth, and they're very much connected, but they're not connected with the Zionist mainstream. They're connected with other Satmar Jews who live in Israel, or who live in the Eretz Yisrael. In fact, one simple way of sort of gauging the attitude is checking at the airport if someone, the plane going to Israel, and you ask, where are you going? If one says, I'm going to Israel, he's a more modern variety. Says, I'm going to Eretz Yisrael, I can be sure he's not a Zionist.
Thank you, Yakov, for this response to the response. And I will now open the room for your questions. Micha and then Hagai, please.
My question is about debates within Orthodoxy. Since there is at least an Orthodox Zionist organization since the 1920s, the National Religious Movement, and not to forget that one of the main problems today the Zionist settlers in the West Bank, which are definitely Orthodox Jews. Or in the rabbinate in Israel, how do they deal with this settler Zionism? What does that mean to Orthodoxy? Or is Orthodoxy split?
Of course it is split. You know, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. That's normal. But, yeah. But I would say that the Mizrahi movement, the Zionist religious movement, which started in Russia the very early years of the 20th century, was explicitly anti-Messianic. It said that we are trying to help observant Jews to live in the land of Israel, to cater to their needs, religious needs, but it should not be construed as Messianic redemption under no circumstances. Then, as you know, there was a transformation of the national of Mizrahi movement into national Judaism, Dati Leumi. So national Judaism is something else, because there the son of Rabbi Kook, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, developed an entire philosophy of political activism to occupy the land as a commandment, as a divine commandment. And they're a very committed group of people who indeed, often at the cost to themselves, occupy different areas. And they have become I say today, the front line of Zionism, because the descendants of those Zionist pioneers from Russia, the secular socialists, many of them actually are here in Berlin.
Sorry, I was in the beginning, I thought you were already finished, but that's why I did like this. No, I wanted to ask, I wanted to respond, even though the question was not directed at me. I think we have to speak about also how we ask the question, because when you ask what's going on with these settlers in the West Bank, what's this problem population over there, right? Maybe this is not a good question. Maybe we have to ask, okay, how do we define and conceptualize and think about the relation between Jews and the territory, or between the nation state and the nation? What is the nation and how does it overlap or also stand in opposition to the nation state, which is where I'm pushing towards is exactly the difference between the state of Israel and Eretz Israel. So settling, what is settling? What is the definition exactly of settling? Why is someone who is living in I'm asking that as a rhetorical question. I know what's the difference politically right now, right? But someone who's living in the West Bank, this is settling, and someone who's living in, I don't know, in Tel Aviv. Is it a different form of settling, or is it the same, or what, you know, I would like to sort of leave a little bit the plane of defining, okay, this is a kind of Orthodox Zionism that works well with liberal assumptions about how Palestinians are supposed to be being treated, and I think Palestinian resistance is legitimate regardless of whether or not we like it or not. Just footnote. But I think we have to ask about, I mean, if you want to have that as an inner Jewish or the Jewish conversation, I think we have to ask about the relation between law versus identity and nation state versus nation, rather than these settlers over there are not okay and these are not, and you know, so.
Excuse me, as far as I know, those settlers are not Zionists. They say it's a mitzvah, it's a divine commandment.
It is.
There.
Well,
And
it is.
have passages from the Torah where that is written.
True.
Yes.
They consider it a divine commandment to settle everywhere in the land of Israel, whatever its borders may be. For them, the line of 1967 is irrelevant. And actually, for most Israeli, it is. And the official Israeli government barely recognizes the line. So, and personally, I think that talking about occupation that lasts more than the history of Israel without occupation makes very little sense. Israel is occupation. Essentially, that's what it is. The situation of Palestinians without citizenship and the situation of Palestinians within citizenship. And you're right, we have to talk about the character of the state. There was a new law passed in 2018 about the nationality law, and it's actually, in a way, clarifies the situation. It didn't create new facts, it just legalizes what was already practiced in Israel.
Chagai, please.
Okay, thank you. It was very interesting. I had many remarks and questions, but I would limit myself to one, because one should be modest. As far as I know, this Orthodox or rabbinical opposition to Zionism is an ideological one. You even called it a theoretical one.
Theological, I think.
Theological. Yeah, okay, so it's theological, which this is another question. What is theological in the frame of Judaism? But this is something else. So this means it's not exactly a halachic one, because Midrash Shloshet HaShvuot, or Ma'amar Shloshet HaShvuot, is a midrash. It's not a halacha. It didn't find its way to the Shulchan Aruch. This could be described as a problem from rabbinic perspective, or as a weakness from within this perspective, because they didn't find a halachic argument against Zionism. So my question would be, would you also see this this way, as a sort of a problem for them? I even read once that the whole thing, Midrash Shloshet HaShvuot, was something sort of, so to speak, in the closet. It wasn't very central in rabbinic ethos before the rise of Zionism. And then it was sort of centralized in the argumentation of rabbinic Judaism, because they didn't have another thing to cling to. Would you find it right, this description, or not?
I would refer you to Aviezer Ravitsky's book, who devotes a lot of attention to it, and he argues that it was used throughout centuries in a quasi-halachic way, and it precedes Zionism. So what he found, and he studied the sources, which I didn't, that it has been the leitmotif, even though it's not an halacha, and in fact, he even devotes, I think, one of the appendices to the book precisely to the issue of three oaths. So I would refer to him, and I have no authority to debate whether it's a weak point or not.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much for both of you, the two of you, for your great contributions. Sitting in this room and being obviously Christian and German, I am getting into a kind of new and never felt of nevucha. First of all, we are now even those who are responsible for Zionism, because we are those, or the Christians, at least some Christians like Tzuberi and Heckler are those who really created or stipulated the Zionist movement back to Palestine. The second, it always hurts me when I hear somebody say the Shoah was a punishment for our sins. I mean, it is such a strong, of course it's in a way strong, right? You get the sovereignty of your own actions if you say you are the guilty one, but still, and it is a punishment that you deserved, so you are not the horribly innocent victims any longer, but still, and I really don't care much about being the guilty one or the inheritant of guilty people here, but still I think this was such a horrible crime that I cannot imagine of any kind of, cannot think of any kind of piety that blames it on the victims.
It's a delicate line, but it's very important. The fact that it is traditional, I think in many religions, calamities are considered a punishment for whatever we did wrong. And the traditional Jewish sort of expression of it, lefashfesh b'ma'aseinu, we have to examine our deeds, our behavior, and so on. This by no means removes the guilt from those who committed the crime. So they are two different things. And it's been debated in traditional Jewish sources with respect to Pharaoh and Exodus from Egypt. So it's a very old story. But I think and that's why I give the example of those people who don't stop to commemorate the genocide of Jews, because for them it fits the entire picture. And that's what I quoted the prayer, because of our sins we have been exiled from the land. It does not justify the behavior of Roman armies.
Okay. Yeah, okay, thank you. I was not so much about asking about the justifying of the evil, but still, there's somehow this absolute lack of protest against it, somehow.
Lack of?
Protest against it. It is really just breathtaking to me. That's what I wanted to say.
But I think it's present even in Christianity, to the little I know, that unless we accept that there is such a thing as serendipity, it just happens.
One last question, please.
Just a point of clarification, Hannah, you're mentioning in the end that you differentiate between two different approaches to kind of critique of Zionism, and the second one was rabbinic and particularity.
Could you take the microphone?
Yeah.
It definitely helps.
I don't think it works.
The question was, I was speaking about these two different directions from which critique of Zionism or political Zionism is offered or theorized, and I differentiated between, on the one hand, the rabbinic, call it particular, specifically Jewish take on Zionism that you represented, or that I would also strongly associate with people like Daniel Boyarin, and the other direction would be from the point of view of universalism and liberalism that would be represented, which I would, let's say, that's a critique that is coming from people like Judith Butler, for example, but not only her. I mean, it's just a form of critique that does not use halakha or the rabbinic tradition as a prism through which to say, okay, this is actually a rupture or so, but which would, for example, strongly focus on the crimes committed against the Palestinians and so forth. So that, right, on inequality or on the way that the nation state exceptionalizes specifically Jewish citizens of the state and so forth. I mean, it's a different direction of critique that is sometimes going hand in hand with a more particular one, but that can also strongly clash, right? Which is because its foundations or sources are different. There are overlaps, but it's two quite different, I think, Stoßrichtungen.
Okay, thank you very much, Yakov. Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you very much for all of you for coming. Outside, hopefully, you will find a reception of pretzels and wine. You are very welcome to stay and continue the conversation. Good evening.